Hey, power people. Welcome to Renewable Rides. I'm Gareth Evans.
And I'm Dan Roberts. We're the founding team of VECKTA, a platform and marketplace streamlining how companies buy on-site energy.
In each episode, we'll uncover the latest trends, challenges, and triumphs relating to the energy transition through the experiences of our team and our inspiring guests.
Our goal is to help companies take action to create a resilient, profitable, sustainable, and thriving energy future.
Let's go.
Renewable Rides listeners, welcome back to another episode. And Dan and I have the pleasure today of being joined by Peter Asmus, and he is a microgrid expert. And Peter, it's awesome to have you.
Thanks for having me.
Peter, we always like to start with, what are you passionate about? So what do you do for fun? What are you passionate about?
What am I passionate about? Well, since we're talking about energy here, I am passionate about energy, although that was never my plan in life. Like a lot of things in my life, things just sort of unfolded. So I got into energy totally by accident, just looking for a job. I'm trained as a journalist. I was a journalism major, graduated in Wisconsin, and literally headed west like they did, centuries ago. Head west, young man. Didn't have a job, just headed west. And eventually, I have been an investigative reporter on money and politics in the past. I've been an arts editor, covering the arts. I am a musician myself. I'm a poet. So I've done a lot of different sort of creative things, but I was just literally looking for a job. And I got hired in about, I don't even remember exactly when, but late 80s. That's how long I've been around looking at energy. And I was the only person who responded to an ad that lived in Sacramento for an energy newsletter. And so they hired me. And at that time, there was a big debate of SMUD, Sacramento Municipal Utility District, over a nuclear reactor called Rancho Seco. And so it was, even because I had a political reporting background, this kind of combined learning about energy in my own community, the public meeting. So it was a municipal utility. So it wasn't like going to the Public Utilities Commission. It was more like just a public meeting, relatively small group. And it was only a few blocks from my house. So through that experience, I learned all about energy and the debate over centralized power, which was a nuclear reactor. And we didn't use the term distributed energy resources back then, but that's essentially what it was. And so, make a long story short, that reactor was the first time a citizen vote shut an operating reactor, and then they had to replace that capacity. It wasn't quite half of the total load, but it was close. And they replaced it with solar, wind, energy efficiency, and all that kind of stuff. So that's how I got into energy. And from there, I've written several books, which I can talk about my favorite book a little later on, maybe, and moved from sort of a journalist to an analyst. So I worked with a company that was first called Pike Research, then Navigant Research, then Guidehouse Insights. And while there, I created some of the first global data sets on microgrids and tried to figure out how to forecast the future, which I have to admit at first, I was just like, how the hell am I supposed to forecast the future growth of microgrids when you have imperfect data? But you learn that, you never often have perfect data. Ideally you would. And so that's how I kind of made my name in the microgrid space, was really being that analyst at VECKTA.
So Peter, what got you into journalism initially? What was it about your childhood or your upbringing or your passions that got you into that?
Well, the first things I wrote were song lyrics to songs I heard on the radio. I'd write my own lyrics, and I didn't even realize that some of them, that's what I had done until later. I said, oh, I must have heard this song on the radio. So I started out as more of like a lyricist, kind of a poet, but I did have a journalism major, and actually in high school started out as a sports editor, then became more of an arts editor in college. And then, as I said, I got into it when I moved to California in Sacramento. I made a name for myself doing investigative reporting on money and politics. So I worked for a company that computerized campaign information, which was public, but no one could do anything with the data because it was just reams of paper sitting in a public office somewhere. So we actually coded it according to all the special interests. So you could say, how much money is he getting from the energy industry, from agriculture, from defense, etc. And actually, the people I work with, we then created a band, which became an activist band for energy issues. And I mentioned the Rancho Seco thing. We played a solar-powered concert at the state capitol steps in 1988. So way back then, we had a solar-powered stage, and it didn't work perfectly, but we did play there. And so that's where I kind of combined my interest in music with energy and politics, basically.
And so what was the transferable skill from journalism into the energy sector, and how has that served you well? We see that education and awareness is a massive challenge in this industry. Was that the link or other?
Yes, because I remember I almost quit when I was first hired. I remember, as you know, the energy world, and back then it was even worse. I shouldn't say worse, but insular, acronyms. So when you would talk to someone, half the time you wouldn't understand, like they say, well, there's the PUC, and then, there's M megawatts versus this versus that. And I remember I almost quit, and I had to record all of the early interviews just to really listen carefully and make sure I got things. But it was for the trade press, so you had to be precise and non-political. So that's where my original reporting was just very fact-based. But I would say the main skill I learned is how to make energy interesting, because back then, most people would say, oh, what do you write about? And you'd say energy, and they go, oh, God, how boring. Until 2000 and 2001, when we had what we call in California the Enron debacle, but when the power started going out, and there was all these stories when suddenly people didn't have electricity, they started becoming more interested. And that's when my third book came out about the wind industry. And so that kind of gave a little boost to that book. And that is actually what I think is my best book. It's called Reaping the Wind: How Mechanical Wizards, Visionaries, and Profiteers Help Shape Our Energy Future. So, that was the time when the skill of just trying to explain the energy system to ordinary folks became a skill. And eventually, that's why even at Guidehouse, my main thing towards the end of my career there was white papers. That's kind of my specialty, is boiling things down, but still having enough depth that you're providing useful information to folks in the industry, but you're writing it in a way that other people can understand. Because as you probably know, a lot of energy literature, people's eyes start glossing over, and you just got to know how deep do you go for certain audiences. And I guess that's something you learn over time.
Yeah, certainly. Well, I appreciate you helping break it down, because I agree with you. It's a complex topic, and one that over your career, more and more people are paying attention to. And I feel like in the last 2-3 years, we've really hit an inflection point of people really needing to think about it. I've noticed that it seems like a lot of the last 5, 6, 7 years of your career is largely focused on distributed energy systems, microgrids. Tell us how you really have focused on that segment of the energy industry, and maybe tell us a little bit about some of your findings in all the different work that you've done.
Well, that originated more when we started having more of those power outages. I mentioned, 2000, 2001, but it was a little bit later. I moved out to this small, tiny town called Stinson Beach, which is, right north of San Francisco. And there the power would go out always after the first rain. The power would go out because I guess the distribution lines were so old, that the moisture would somehow, and there were some local people. There was actually a woman who's a Rockefeller. I won't name her name because she's sort of like this underground, one of the Rockefellers, but she created an organic farm. She's like the rebel Rockefeller. And so she's very, doesn't want anybody to know who she is, but she provided some funding because she was talking about resilience, using that term. And so we started asking people, well, why can't we just have our own energy system here? We're small, we're kind of isolated, and started learning about all the rules, as you know, about utility monopolies. You can't transfer electricity over a public right of way. You cannot share the electricity with your neighbor. All these rules are sort of starting to bend a little bit, and there's creative ways of getting around some of those rules. But that's kind of where it started, is at the local level. And we even did a solar event to educate people about it. And this woman ended up giving 10 grand to 3 different community centers, kind of do solar. And then one created a little primitive microgrid with a lead acid battery. And just, his main thing was the power system once went out during a concert. Like, the power went out, and he was like, that's my critical load, is my sound system. Going, okay, well, that makes sense. And I think he had refrigerator and telecom, and he literally was kind of just jerry-rigging this primitive microgrid. And so then when I got hired by Pike Research, my first report was on ocean energy, which at the time there was a lot of hype about. This is 2009, tidal power, wave power, hydrokinetic, ocean thermal. And there was a big hype cycle, and that forecasting the future of that, if I looked at my forecast, I mean, it was so off. But, it was a lot of hype, and it was the first time I did a forecast. But the second report was on microgrids, and that one ended up being their bestseller of all time, and so that was when people were starting to focus more on microgrids. There was also the ARRA funding, ARRA funding, which planted seeds to sort of smart grid, microgrid projects. And back then, a lot of the debate was defining what's the difference between a smart grid and a microgrid, because originally they were kind of almost characterized as opposites, although over time, I think they're more viewed as, there's one way to get to a smarter grid is through microgrids. And I'd say the main change that's happened since 2009 to now is more growing acceptance, sometimes reluctantly by utilities, of microgrids and the value of DERs. As you know, originally utilities would just not even pay attention to solar PV installations because they were so small, so few of them. They wouldn't even include it in the planning. Fast forward to now, and if you don't pay attention to DERs, you're going to have some major problems.
Yeah, and we're seeing significant growth for businesses, commercial industrial businesses. Why do you think that is, Peter? What has changed that now there is this interest, and to your point, people who aren't paying attention to this are going to be left behind? What's the catalyst there, and why do you think this is starting to really take off?
Well, I think one of the things I said is when I first started forecasting microgrids, the commercial and industrial segment was one of the smallest segments of the data we could collect. Part of the challenge is C&I customers are the most reluctant to give data. They're kind of like, it's my private industry. Why should I give you data on my projects for, a data set that someone might buy, or a public data set? But I'd say now commercial and industrial customers are probably the fastest growing market, mainly because we've had so many power outages. And one of the challenges with microgrids right now, there is not an established value for resilience. There's not a dollar like I used to do adders, and they still do in certain regular, you get an adder because of its power, but there is no VOR, value of resilience. And I remember going to conferences where there was a lot of debate, well, if you make it too complicated, people will spend years trying to calculate that value, and what's going to happen in the meantime. You make it too simple, will it, stand up? But C&I customers know what it costs when the grid goes down. Like when in California, you started having these public power safety shutoffs. If you were a small business and you were without power for 3 days, you could say, I lost 300 grand, 500 grand, whatever that number is. And so they actually have internal metrics that can justify it. The other thing that's happened is the solar prices, the battery prices have gone down so much. So it's not like you have to choose between cost savings and resilience and even sustainability. Nowadays, through a microgrid and other platforms. The other thing that I've been doing a lot of work on, virtual power plants, another buzzword out there, both aggregations of DERs with slightly different nuanced differences. The argument that, and you still hear this even in Alaska a little bit, that, renewables are costly, they're unreliable, you don't know when the sun is shining, don't know when the wind's blowing. All those things have been, because of storage and advanced controls, are manageable. And so you can lower costs, have greater resiliency, and reduce emissions all at the same time. It sounds too good to be true, but people are doing it.
Yeah, we're seeing it firsthand with customers that are adopting it. I'd like to dig in a little bit more, Peter, and maybe you can share from some of your research on the resilience and the reliability side. It's something that comes up, but I don't think, unless someone has experienced an outage or a meaningful outage, it's kind of one of those things where until it happens to you, you don't need it. In here in California, nobody thinks about earthquake insurance until an earthquake happens, type of thing. And
Right.
so I'm curious from your research what you're finding, because a lot of the other mechanisms in energy, whether it be retail electricity in deregulated states, or buying into virtual power purchase agreements into big, large scale solar, large scale wind farms. That's not going to solve for an outage because you don't have energy at your facility. And so how should business leaders be thinking about it if they haven't necessarily experienced a major outage event?
Well, I think, you use the word insurance. I think that's part of it, is you want to be prepared. And I would say the other thing we didn't mention yet is that the frequency of outages has increased dramatically. I think for microgrids, it really started with the hurricanes on the East Coast, because I think the first state to pass a microgrid law was Connecticut back in 2011. And I think that was right after Superstorm Sandy. And that was, I used to say states didn't have any microgrid programs, but you can't say that anymore. It sort of started, but it really started more on the East Coast with hurricanes, and kind of all of the states kind of, I don't know, I haven't looked, North Carolina or DC and North, almost all those states, New Jersey, Massachusetts, they all have some sort of microgrid program. Now, not all of them were focused on renewables per se. Like Connecticut, for example, focused a lot on fuel cells because there were a lot of fuel cell companies manufactured there. So, I think the other thing is the extreme weather events are more common. We had a freeze in Texas, remember, like unprecedented freeze. You have the wildfires in California, and you've got all kinds of stuff. And microgrids won't always protect you against all contingencies. But, there is a story of one microgrid nearby. It's called Stone Edge Farm. I don't know if you've ever heard of this, but yeah. It's got like 8 batteries. So it's kind of an exception to the rule. But it continued to operate while wildfires were burning around it, and they just put it in kind of the most basic mode because they didn't know if they had internet. They couldn't do a lot of the real fancy sort of nuanced maybe optimization, but they put it like in a basic mode. And I think last I heard, that microgrid's been operating in island mode for like 3 years. The guy just sort of eventually said, I don't want to buy from the utility. I don't want to trade with the utility. I just want my own microgrid, Now, that's an exception. I would say really the bigger trend now is the opposite, where people are saying my microgrid can become a virtual power plant or be part of a virtual power plant. So you can have your own resiliency, you can have your own cost reduction. Like I have in my own home. I finally got a solar system, battery system, took forever to install, and I wrote a blog about that experience. And now I'm now part of a virtual power plant. I just found out recently because it's part of Sunrun, the biggest residential, and they now have a virtual power plant program. I haven't been called upon, but I can even adjust my battery. So I have my default settings for kind of my own home resiliency. But when there's an event, shortage of power on the grid, I can contribute my excess battery capacity, and I change the settings to have more battery available during those events. So in this case, I'm a part of is I think what's happening broader is that microgrids can both be internally focused to the value to the customer, and eventually you can get more revenue by sharing excess capacity, supporting the larger grid. And I think that's why more utilities are less opposed to microgrids. I'd still say that not all utilities warmly embrace. The exception is Alaska, where there's 100 utilities in Alaska, and they are doing the microgrids because that's all there is. So Alaska is kind of the outlier in that regard. Mm-hmm. So sorry, I'm kind of rambling here, but
that was good. And I think one of the things that I took from what you just described there that I think is really important is oftentimes I feel people hear the term microgrid and think extremely complex. The Stone Edge example, and Stone Edge is on that range. I mean, I believe they even have an electrolyzer at their facility and produce their own hydrogen for some hydrogen vehicles. And so that is an extreme example. But a microgrid does not have to be complex. It can be as simple as what you just described at your house or other businesses have, where it's just solar storage in the form of batteries and some level of controls so you can interact with the grid and island. So I think maybe you can pull on that a little bit, where microgrid sounds complex, but it's actually much more approachable than I think most people think.
Right. Well, the other trend, I'm glad you brought that up, because I did a report before I left Guidehouse on what I called modular microgrids. So the other trend, you used to go to a microgrid conference and everyone would say, you've seen one microgrid, you've seen one microgrid. That was or it's 31 flavors. There's 31 flavors of microgrids, like the ice cream, whatever it was, Baskin Robbins or whatever. But the counter trend to all that is simplifying, standardizing microgrids. And this is particularly relevant for C&I customers and off-grid applications. Off-grid, it's more like containerized solutions, like Box Power is one company out there that I know has done some projects actually in California and Alaska, where it's like a pre-packaged, your microgrid is going to have solar, battery, and maybe a generator, hopefully fuel flexible generator. So you could, that's another trend, is to just have being contingency that what if there is no diesel fuel, natural gas fuel, or biogas or hydrogen down the road. So there's these containerized microgrid in a box. It's not quite that simple, but companies that have more modular offerings, like a company, maybe they have Home Depot or some kind of box retailer whose stores tend to be about the same size. So then they develop a product, for certain size facilities, but they have kind of standardized features, like they all have solar, all have a battery. Maybe they don't have a generator, maybe they do, or they have some controls. So that is another trend, is kind of saying that customized engineering microgrid takes a long time. How do you shrink that down, and how do you really deploy them? I would say my greatest disappointment in California, where I live, is when those wildfires hit in 2017, I thought, oh, this is it. Microgrids, they're going to be, there are going to be so many microgrids going out. But unfortunately, the regulators, and I don't want to name names or point fingers or whatever, I thought what they should have incentivized are these more modular systems for rural water districts, critical facilities, that are relatively small. I actually tried to make a microgrid happen in Stinson Beach. It took forever because, first of all, the battery they needed was so small, it wasn't part of the portfolio that was offered by the community choice aggregator who had a program for batteries. So first of all, they couldn't find a battery small enough, to fit that niche application. So my vision of the future is we're always going to have bigger, more complex microgrids, like a college campus. You're not going to find a solution for I think ABB once told me, once you go above 4 megawatts, and this is years ago when before ABB split into Hitachi and ABB, that 4 megawatts was the threshold where you could have kind of a modular. I think they were talking about a containerized kind of application for emerging economies. So, but I think more and more of the microgrids will be more standardized, and that's how you can really deploy them at scale. And who knows, in the future, people might be even designing buildings to meet the specs of kind of a standardized microgrid solution. I could see that happening down the road. We're not there yet, but hopefully that's what would start happening. So we can really roll out more of these systems quicker.
Yep. Peter, I think a few things. One, that's certainly, the points you raised about the complexity and the time and all that. That's why we started VECKTA, is actually to simplify that whole process for customers to actually design and then buy these systems. But I think you mentioned big box stores. I was chatting to one the other day, and they're deploying solar only. And when I was speaking to them, they said, we just don't have the capacity to even think about batteries, and the suppliers that we're working with don't work with batteries. And so it's not on our horizon. But when I looked at the business case for them, they were leaving huge amounts of money on the table. I think that batteries are expensive and complex is a fairly big misconception in the market. Do you agree? And what are the primary misconceptions are you seeing?
Yeah, I mean, I think people do think, oh no, I can't take that on. I just want to do solar. But I think especially as the rules scale back some of the subsidies, just like with net metering, I actually was lucky in California to get mine right underneath the deadline when they greatly reduced, basically the credits. But what that does is it means, the battery then becomes almost a no-brainer. Then, if you're getting less for the extra solar you're sending back to the grid, then to get the value out of that solar system, you should have a battery. And, what size that battery is, really depends on what level of resiliency. I mean, quite frankly, I just have a Tesla Powerwall. I forgot what it's rated, probably 13 kilowatt hours or whatever it's rated, but it backs up quite a bit. In fact, the only time during the last power outage I knew there was a power outage is that the microwave wasn't working. That wasn't one of the things hooked up to as a critical load, I guess. It was, didn't even have a blip, but yeah, I think batteries are the key. I think sometimes their need is overstated because some people think, oh yeah, well, the wind, we never know when it blows, and the sun, a cloud. There are other ways you can manage variability, like demand response, on the big grid or load. But I think you need all those. I mean, ideally, you'd have your full toolkit. You'd have a battery, but you'd also be able to reduce loads that were non-critical. And of course, part of this is also with the controls, having a control system that can respond and do nuanced changes, and all of that's the other thing that we haven't mentioned is the controls from microgrids of just the advances, and AI, again, overhyped, but all of those things have happened. So when I think back to my first microgrid report to today, and that's like a 15-year period, it's amazing all of the technology. And we haven't mentioned yet the business model innovation with things like energy as a service. My system here was installed, no money down. I'm basically paying off a mortgage, but I'm still basically saving money given that the utility rates, especially here in California, but other keep going up. So, it's kind of hard to say no when you can say no upfront capital costs, solar battery, costs maybe about equivalent now, but eventually I'll be saving more money.
Yeah, that's the exciting thing is it's both the combination of technology costs coming down, but also, great new commercial models like what you're experiencing yourself. Well, so Peter, you've done a ton of amazing things. What's the most exciting project that you're working on right now?
Well, I would say it's most exciting, but it's also in some ways the most taxing. That is writing another book. So I said I would never write another book after my last one, which came out in around 2009. That was my fourth primary book. So my first book came out in 1990, where I was brought on as originally like a ghostwriter and then became a co-author. And that was called In Search of Environmental Excellence. There was a book called In Search of Excellence, so it was kind of a copycat, but it was a Simon & Schuster book, and Jacques Cousteau's son wrote the foreword. And so it was really a book about how business can be part of environmental solutions. And at the time, I felt like I was selling out, I have to admit, because I was kind of a radical environmental activist. Like I said, I was fighting against Rancho Seco. I had my solar powered, activist band and all that stuff. But looking back, I realized, I was onto something, because that's what attracted me to renewable energy was, it's easy to shut down something bad, nuclear power plant, bad, okay, what are you going to do to replace it? And that's when I became more interested in renewable energy. And then I wrote a book about that, about Sacramento's experience. Then I wrote a book about wind power. Then I wrote a book about the history of energy in California, which is like a textbook. And now I'm writing a book about Alaska, energy innovation, focusing on the remote communities, because what's ironic about Alaska is the part of Alaska where there's the Railbelt grid, which is where it's closest to like the lower 48, there's a transmission system. They are lagging behind on carbon reductions and market reforms, and in some ways are like, could say, are 25 years behind the times. I mean, if you wanted to be critical, there are reasons. Now they're getting some more federal money to upgrade the transmission system. So actually, there's good news on the horizon. But where the innovation has happened in California, these remote communities where there is no grid, and there's Kodiak Island is almost 100% renewable energy. There's another community featured as Kotzebue, which did a lot of early pioneering work with small wind, integrating wind, and now we're adding solar. And then there's Cordova, which has done underground power lines, years ago, does free EV charging for their customers, and has done a lot of innovation with hydro and batteries. So, that's my biggest project right now, is finishing another book. And I'm basically, most of the book is in the voices of other people. So I'm a ghostwriter for part of it, but my chapter is the last one where I tie it all together. And that's where I get to sort of give my 2 cents worth on, what does Alaska need to do now to kind of take it to the next level, given the state of the climate crisis. And because a lot of renewables in Alaska is not driven by policy, it's driven by pure economics, the high cost of diesel. So renewables save you money. So there, hasn't really been doing renewables because of a renewable portfolio standard or even climate change. But now I think there's a realization, because folks in Alaska are feeling the effects of climate change much more dramatically. But let's say the whole Arctic is feeling it more dramatically than almost any part of the world. So I think it's not even necessarily a political issue. How to solve it, there's a lot of difference of opinion. But anyways, that's probably my most exciting, is this book.
I think when we were both there together a few weeks ago, Peter, I think what surprised me the most was when people from the outside look into the likes of the Railbelt you describe, they'd say, well, they're operating on coal. Why don't they just double down on gas? Gas is the transition fuel. But what was described was, we're actually running out of gas. And to get gas into Alaska is also very expensive. Most of the gas is used as part of the oil processing facility up on the North Slope. And that actually surprised me a lot. So, you're trying to wind down the likes of the coal, you haven't got access to gas, or your gas resources are running out for easy access. So you naturally have to then start exploring your other options. And the other options have got huge resources to leverage. It's just, how do you actually do it in a really repeatable and scalable way?
Yeah, and I know that this legislative session, because I know there's a fellow named Chris Rose. I don't know if you know who Chris Rose is, but he's been working on the policy front, and for years, each end of the legislative session has been like, nothing happened again. But this year, a couple big things happened. In part, they got a lot of, and you may have heard about, federal funding to expand the transmission system. So I guess that's what's been a limiting factor, is that transmission system is so old that it needs reinforcement too. They remove, right now, it's very difficult. Like if there's excess wind at the southern end of the rail belt, it's almost impossible to get that excess wind to the microgrid that's at the top of the rail belt, in part because they don't they have old-fashioned ways of charging for electricity. It's not like, they have no grid operator that says, we're just going to, like a neutral traffic cop. Okay, access here, you send it up there. All the utilities are still kind of little fiefdoms, I guess, if you will. So there are moving towards market reforms, like I think just doing demand response so they could integrate the renewables better. So it's great that these microgrids exist and they touch each other, but what they haven't done is figured out how to kind of make them work more synergistically and be able to share that excess renewables. Because as they expand to renewables, that's going to become an issue. You don't want to waste excess wind. And what a lot of the remote communities have done, this is one of their main innovations, converted it to thermal energy, because of course Alaska can get extremely cold. And so they've done a lot of really interesting things with distributed heating systems in these smaller villages, converting that excess wind to thermal energy. So that's one of the main advances Alaska has done.
Yeah, eager to follow the work that you're doing there, and I've been really enjoying learning about the nuances of Alaska and how they transfer across to other areas of the world in the work that we've been doing with remote communities up there. Well, Peter, let's transition to the power surge round. It's been an awesome conversation. Love all your dedication through the last many decades to this space. We touched on it before we started recording. So now I'm eager to hear if you could be any energy technology, what would it be and why?
I would be an electric vehicle, because I think electric vehicles, and I did have a position I recently left with a company called AutoGrid, which then became Uplight, which was a software company more interested in VPPs, but now also getting into the microgrid space. And I remember the CEO saying that EVs were the most transformative technology, because here you have an asset. I always thought, I never used to use those terms, but that provides mobility, cleans up transportation emissions, but also can be plugged in, and the battery could be used to back up your home, could be part of a microgrid. Also, as we rely more on EVs, you're actually going to need more microgrids, because imagine if the grid's less and less reliable, but more and more people are relying on their EVs, so I think there's this amazing synergy between DERs in general, but especially EVs. And in a place like California, which already has I don't know what it is, 1.6 million EVs, I was actually advocating for a bill introduced last year that would have mandated those EVs be bidirectional, because that is such a huge resource. And part of it is just managing the charging. So, people don't all come home at 5 o'clock and charge and the grid collapses or whatever. But a part of it is leveraging those things as a resource, as a resiliency resource, et cetera. Now we have a ways to go, but there are use cases. Like the best example would be school buses. They have a schedule, when they're out there riding, that they're often parked during the summer when school is out, huge batteries. I mean, I think that's one of the most exciting crossovers between transportation and electricity. So you kind of have an asset that can deal with both transportation sector emissions and electricity sector things. So it took me, I didn't like that question, as you know, but then I thought, EVs, that's what I could say.
And our audience is always hungry for more information, Peter. You're obviously well read. Either where do you get your information, or which of your books or resources would you recommend the most?
Well, I think my best book is the Wind book, more because of the writing. I tried to write it almost like a novel. So I follow characters. There's one character, his name is Randy Tinkerman, and it's just a great name, Tinkerman. And he's kind of like a mobster. He's seen all the dirt. So the book has, it has some blemishes of what, the early wind industry, there were a lot of failures. There were a lot of tax credits. It wasn't, let's say, a well-orchestrated development. On the other hand, the amount of technology advances for wind within a very short period of time, if you look what the federal government did, and then you look at what California did with deregulation and private investment, so much more advances happened with the more private sector oriented philosophy. And a lot of that was just doing smaller wind turbines and then clustering them in a wind farm, realizing that even if you had failures, you had enough machines producing enough electricity to deliver on a contract. These are the commercial things. So I would say, that's my, of my own books, favorite books. I get so much stuff. I don't know if I have a favorite source of information because I get so much stuff, but I tend to be focused more on the DER stuff. It's amazing what you can just find on LinkedIn, when you go through your feeds. In fact, I have to just sort of unplug sometimes because it becomes like a time sink, like, oh my God, I just spent an hour looking at all the different reports. Now, for my own stuff, I do have my own website, which I'm revamping. It's just my name, peterasmus.com, which has, a lot of my white papers on there. It's got blogs I've written for various people. It's got copies of newspaper articles I've done, and it has copies of radio interviews I've done on my own little radio show. It's just a community radio station, but I've talked to people at Stonehenge Farm, and I've talked to kind of more of I call it locavolt. So I had this thing calling up with locavolt is people who are interested in generating power locally. So there's a section on the website that's more focused on that sort of small scale local activism that I've also done.
That's great. And let's finish out with you finishing this sentence. I will have been successful when
it is easy for everybody to install their own energy system. As I mentioned, it took me so long to get my solar and battery system installed. And I'm someone in the industry. I mean, I had to threaten people. I was going to write an article in the local newspaper complaining. And part of it was the HOA, Homeowners Association. Part of it was the company involved, misinformation. And part of it was just changing regulations, so the good news is regulations are generally moving in a good direction, although some would argue not so on solar net metering in California. But, it has to be simpler. And in fact, we're going to have a meeting in my local subdivision to try to network with people and educate them about, so it should be that people should be able to, install a system, just a simple solar battery system within 3 months or something like that. In my view, that's where we have to get it instead of a year and a half or whatever it took me. That's success, is making those modular, well, partly this is not a commercial for your company, but making that whole process simpler, and I think the education, the good news is more people are educated and more people are interested. You don't have to be on the left end of the spectrum or the right end of the spectrum to want your own independent power and resiliency. It's kind of like, how can you be against that? And if you can also support the larger grid, like I can through a VPP, what's not to like? That's my view. So making that an easier value proposition for all people, and especially, folks who might not be able to afford, there are special programs. So keeping in mind the equity issue. So it's not just the wealthy that benefit, which has been kind of the standard argument. I think we are getting to a point where the middle class can enjoy, and hopefully, there are special programs for disadvantaged communities as well.
Amen. Amen. Energy sovereignty is good business. It's good for people. It's good for communities. Good for the overall grid. Good for the planet, our society. So we wholeheartedly agree. Well, Peter, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you for all the dedication that you've had over the last many decades to this industry and your focus on microgrids and distributed energy over the last many years. We're excited to continue to follow your work and see the new book on Alaska here when it comes out, and we'll link off to your website and some of your other resources in the show notes. So again, thank you for your time, and let's keep getting these things out here and making it simpler for people to deploy them.
Sounds great. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Peter.
Gareth, what an interesting guy Peter is. He's got so much history in the space and such a unique perspective. What were some of the things that stood out for you?
Yeah, he's been around the block, hasn't he? And I think what was great for me to hear is he's seen everything from nuclear to solar to wind, and his career naturally pushed him towards microgrids and on-site energy systems, and that's because of the value they can generate. And he was seeing more and more opportunity in that space. And I think the biggest takeaway for me is resilience is really the catalyst for where microgrids came from. He referenced the hurricanes in the Northeast, and we're now seeing wildfires and ice storms and all these kind of severe weather events that have led to microgrids being important for businesses to have resilient operations. But I think the reality is these systems have now become really economically viable versus the baseline grid services, even without pricing in resilience, just from an economic being able to beat your cost of utility rates, which is awesome. And I think if we can build in that value of resilience and make businesses think about what would be the cost to your business of an outage, factoring that in just makes these systems unbelievably economic. And I think that's the opportunity for us all to embrace. What do you think?
Yeah, the kind of building on that, he talked quite a bit about virtual power plants, which is a growing kind of and very hot topic right now of being able to have demand side management, manage loads and use demand response, leverage battery systems and use them at a large scale. There might be thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, soon to be millions of these distributed energy resources where if there's communication between the utilities and these load centers, as well as these storage sources in the form of battery, as well as EVs, as he had talked about, I think that's going to be necessary to both support the load growth, support the grid fragility and the aging grid, to be able to not just deliver power, but be able to reduce the loads and pull from resources when they're available, when the grid is most constrained. So I'm excited to see kind of how this space continues to evolve, and we'll do some more episodes in the future, pulling in some experts in that particular area. So I really appreciated his experience and breadth of knowledge over the past many decades that he's been in the space. So excited to see what he yields out of all the research that he's been working on there in Alaska.
Yeah, totally. And I think last comment would be, even for someone in the industry who wanted to do this personally for their own house, he found it really hard. And I think it really highlights for us, doesn't it, that the work we're doing in terms of providing this enabling technology to really streamline the whole process and remove the complexity, remove the headaches and the schedules, compress everything is super valuable. And we need to be doubling down on that. So really good episode.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Catch you.
See ya.
We receive a lot of questions from business leaders around the world wanting to learn more about the energy transition, what is possible and where to start. So to help you stay informed and up to date on best practices, opportunities, risks and success stories, we created an industry newsfeed at VECKTA.com/news with all our podcasts, blogs and newsletter. Check it out and connect with Dan, myself, and the VECKTA team to learn more. Cheers and have a good one.